Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Rose Nunziata, and I'm going to be presenting in our group's independent assessment of Iceland's climate action plan. I'd like to just start by thanking my entire team for all of their efforts towards doing this analysis, particularly our managers, Isabel and Laura, and our faculty advisor, Professor McGinnis, for all of their guidance throughout the semester. I want to begin by just introducing everyone to the natural beauty Iceland is best known for. Its waterfalls and its glaciers, its blue lagoons, volcanic soils. It's home to the Northern Lights, one of the natural wonders of the world. And it's this natural beauty that brings millions of people every year to Iceland as part of the tourism industry that's a huge driver of Iceland's economy. Our client for this project was the Ministry for the Environment and Natural Resources and the Minister Guðmundur. It's important to point out that Iceland has a very progressive political climate, and they currently have a virtually carbon-free electricity system due to the hydro and geothermal energy sources on the island. Our contact was Professor Brynhildur of the University of Iceland and Ingun, a PhD candidate and actually an ESP alum. They brought us this project and they helped guide us throughout the entire research process. So in 2018, Iceland introduced a new climate action plan with two main goals. The first one was to meet their Paris Agreement commitments by 2030, which means reducing their non-industrial emissions by 29% from 2005 levels. And their second goal is to become carbon neutral by 2040, which means either eliminating all of their emissions or eliminating emissions down to a point and then sequestering back up to that point. The plan is laid out in 34 actions under 4 different topics: clean energy and transport, clean energy and other sectors, land use and forestry, and other measures. Land use and forestry is also known as LULUCF for land use change, and forestry. This is an umbrella term that can refer to various things, but for this presentation, I'm going to be using it to specifically refer to wetland restoration and reforestation. So the main question we've been tasked with answering is, are the steps outlined in the climate action plan sufficient to meet both the 2030 and 2040 targets? Building off of that question, we developed a few follow-up questions we felt would be important to answer in order to fully complete our assessment, including, are the current resources being allocated correctly? Are the resources adequate to meet the needs? And are there any further steps that Iceland needs to take in order to complete their reach their goals that they set out for themselves? From there, we identified a few critical components of the climate action plan that we wanted to base our assessment on, including carbon sequestration, EU regulations, and innovative technology. We did a literature review to get a better understanding of what the topics were and what Iceland was already doing. And from there, we conducted stakeholder interviews with wetland scientists, sheep farmers, and innovative companies currently operating in Iceland. We used these interviews to get a better understanding of what was happening on the ground, how people felt about the climate action plan, and to fill in the blanks for any questions that we felt our literature review was unable to answer. We faced a few challenges while doing this assessment. The first one simply being a language barrier. We often had to translate various documents from Icelandic to English in order to utilize them. We had to navigate the complex EU rules and regulations regarding what can and cannot count towards the Paris Agreement commitments. And unfortunately, we had to conduct all of our stakeholder interviews virtually, obviously via Zoom, instead of in person as we had originally planned. The first thing our team wanted to do was get a better understanding of what Iceland's goals were and what they were already doing to meet those goals. So this graph is demonstrating the 2030 goals for meeting the Paris Agreement commitments. So in the year 2005, Iceland's total non-industrial emissions was 3,000 kilotons per year. A 29% reduction in that brings their 2030 goal down to 2,200 kilotons per year. Current efforts already being taken by Iceland have reduced their non-industrial emissions by about 19%, bringing their 2030 projected total non-industrial emissions to 2,520 kilotons per year. That leaves a gap of about 320 kilotons between what is projected and what their goal is. Our team really set out to assess whether or not the steps in the climate action plan could fill that gap of 320 kilotons over the next 10 years. Through our research and our interviews, we're able to come up with 5 key findings, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes expanding on each one. Our first finding was that while Iceland's goals are ambitious and multifaceted, there are a few conflicts of interest present at this time, particularly in the land use sector. Right now, people are trying, excuse me. Right now, we have sheep farmers, forest restoration, and wetland restoration, reforestation and wetland restoration. All of that cannot happen on the same parcel of land. So we do have these different groups who are expressing this inability to meet their goals with one another. Our team determined that an increase in collaboration, interest alignment, and knowledge sharing among these key stakeholders would greatly increase Iceland's chances of meeting the goals it laid out for itself. We determined that LULUCF is going to be vital towards reaching Iceland's 2040 goals of carbon neutrality. Again, LULUCF is referring to land use change, and forestry. Current efforts by Iceland are not enough, but early action and an increase in both wetland restoration and reforestation will have huge long-term impacts towards meeting those goals. On the other hand, due to the time and resources it takes to implement these actions, we do feel that LULUCF is going to be less relevant towards meeting the 2030 goals of meeting the Paris Agreement commitments. Throughout all of our stakeholder interviews, everyone expressed to us that the biggest roadblock they're currently facing is insufficient funding, particularly with wetland restoration. Right now, the Icelandic government is the only funding source for most of these projects. And while they have allocated significant resources towards them in the past, including an additional $50 million committed through the Climate Action Plan, we did determine that an increase in funding will be necessary in order to fully utilize these measures to reach the 2040 goal. Due to EU regulations, LULUCF can only count towards a small portion of the 320 kiloton gap between what is projected and what the goal is for 2030. Filling the rest of that gap, which is about 300 kilotons, is possible, but we are going to need to see more concentrated efforts in other high emission sectors, particularly transportation, including commercial and heavy trucking, the fishing industry, which is a huge portion of Iceland's economy, and agriculture, which in Iceland is mainly sheep farming. None of these sectors are going to be able to close that gap alone, and we're going to need to see increased efforts across the spectrum. And finally, throughout our analysis, we ran into various data gaps that we determined additional research is going to be needed in order to fill, including the carbon sequestration potential of wetland restoration, a mapping of the soil types throughout Iceland in order to determine their carbon sequestration potential, and the specific actions needed from other sectors in order to fill the rest of that 320 kiloton gap. Through our assessment, we determined that Iceland's 2040 carbon neutrality goal is achievable, but due to significant implementation and execution issues, the goal of meeting the 2030 Paris Agreement commitments is less certain at this time. In order to address our findings, we came up with a few policy recommendations for the ministry to consider. The first one is an annual emissions reduction summit, which would bring together stakeholders, particularly those in the land use sector, in order for them to collaborate and come up with industry-wide climate goals and actions. To address the increase in funding that we determined would be necessary, we developed a few innovative financing solutions, including grants to landowners for filling in wetlands that had been previously drained, and potentially hosting a carbon sequestration marketplace for landowners to earn credits for any carbon sequestration happening on their land. And finally, we determined that an action plan outlining the steps that other sectors need to take to close the gap will be instrumental in achieving Iceland's goals for both 2030 and 2040. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. And are there any questions from the group here? Please.
You guys can raise your hands if you have questions.
Okay, Steve.
Oh, we have, yeah,
Oh,
Professor Chilred has one.
And then somebody else too. I see
Yep.
2 hands. Wow. 3 hands. Okay.
So, can you put Iceland's emissions into perspective with other countries? I mean, they're not necessarily going to meet these goals, but are their emissions tiny in comparison to everyone else?
As I mentioned, they do have a virtually carbon-free electricity system. Most of their emissions are resulting from industry and fishing and things like that. So they do have much lower levels of emissions than other countries. When we did this analysis, we did in the beginning kind of address the fact that we're coming from an American institution, and America has the highest emissions, some of the highest emissions per capita in the world. And we're addressing the emissions of a country with significantly lower emissions than our country. So yes, they do have much lower emissions than other countries, but still they do want to take different steps in order to contribute towards fixing the very large problem of climate change.
And what was that green briefcase you had in a picture of the guy walking across the tundra?
Oh, it was different saplings for trees. It was,
Okay.
I don't know if it was a briefcase, but it was different saplings for trees for reforestation.
Okay. Stephanie, have any other questions? I saw
Yes.
two other hands.
We have a question from Molly. So Molly, I'm
Okay.
going to unmute you.
Hi, Molly.
Hi. So I'm really fascinated about the role of tourism in emissions, and I understand that Iceland can't necessarily, how do I want to put this? Emissions from folks flying into the island aren't necessarily their problem when it comes to emissions, but I'm curious if that was something you guys talked about at all, or kind of ways that maybe they could offset some of the emissions generated by tourism and by that aviation. Thank you.
Yeah, we did definitely talk about that in the beginning, how, as I mentioned, tourism is a huge part of their economy, and one of the biggest emissions resulting from it, like you mentioned, were people flying in. It's the only way to get there. We did feel that our innovative solutions team did look into it, but we felt that it wasn't anything that Iceland can do particularly right now, especially because most of the, like you mentioned, it's not really quote unquote their fault. It's not entirely their responsibility to do that, but the various carbon sequestration steps that they can take both through natural solutions and through technology could offset the emissions from people flying to Iceland.
Okay, Stephanie, I think we have time for one more question here.
Yes, Anastasia has a question.
Hi, Anastasia.
Hi, Kelly. Good job. My question is, I guess, along similar vein. I was curious about the plan or what sort of initiatives other sectors would engage in order to reduce their carbon emissions.
So one of the sectors, agriculture, Zach was looking into it and found different ways they can manage their soil and manage manure in order to emit less and actually sequester more. Most of their emissions come from the animals themselves, which is a little bit more difficult to reduce those emissions. The fishing industry, we're looking into electric versions of the boats, which would eliminate a lot of their emissions from the fuels. And again, kind of in a similar vein with the trucking industry, which would mainly be a shift towards electric vehicles or potentially biofuels, something like that, in order to eliminate those emissions that come directly from fossil fuels.